Horror is a genre I always say is a lot like comedy. It means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. Sometimes it's as simple as jump scares, sometimes it's gore, sometimes it's haunted houses or possessions, sometimes it's monsters. But this book, The Hole by Hye-Young Pyun, fits squarely in the psychological horror category. This is a book I knew absolutely nothing about. I saw it on sale. I picked it up. It was only 150 pages long. And you know me, I love short books. And it also had very divisive reviews. And I'm sure I've said this before on the channel, but it really reminds me of the director Nick Refn when he says, when 50% of the audience loves it and 50% of the audience hates it, you know you've made art. So all of these things were enough to intrigue me to pick it up. But what is the hook? What is The Hole about? A man named Ogi finds himself in the hospital after a brutal car accident in which he lost his wife. Unable to care for himself, he eventually moves back home, where a caretaker and his mother-in-law see to his needs. Isolation begins to take its toll. His mother-in-law begins to wear his wife's clothes. His caregiver becomes abusive. Trapped in his bed, paralyzed, Ogi has little chance but to succumb to the madness. So what did I think? Well, before I begin with character, like I always do, I'd like to talk about the chapter headers because they were very unique. Very simple, I might add. I'll put some pictures up right here so you can see the progression of this mysterious black circle. So it's relatively small when you begin the book, and as you progress through every chapter, it slowly gets larger and larger. I thought this was such a beautiful way to kind of communicate the dread in a novel like this, right? This is a very slow burn novel, even though it's only 150 pages long. And I didn't notice this until I think I was like 75% into the book or something like that. And it was funny because it just hit me. I was like, man, this black circle is getting so huge on here. And then I said, wait a minute, is it getting bigger? And so I went back and sure enough, it was getting bigger. And it put a big smile on my face because those subtle things in books are so often overlooked. So I can appreciate the graphic designer who did the layout, the publisher for making it happen. But anyway, I thought I would just bring that up because I thought it was pretty cool. All right, finally, character. Well, let's begin with our protagonist, Ogi, and hopefully I'm pronouncing that correctly. He's in his mid-40s. He's been in a terrible accident. He wakes up in the hospital, his jaw is shattered, he's paralyzed. And I know what you may be saying right now. This sounds a lot like Stephen King's Misery, or at least the beginning of it. And in fact, there are similarities. He does go home, his mother-in-law takes care of him. He also has a caregiver. However, that's pretty much where the similarities end. Whereas I feel like Misery was more about toxic fandom, all right? Somebody being so obsessive that it kind of drives them mad. I guess she was already pretty crazy. Whereas this book isn't about that whatsoever. It's really about a man who has regrets in life. We find out that his wife, even though she is dead now, through his memories, we find out that they had a very troubled marriage. There's a lot of tension between them. He was a professor who worked a lot. She wanted to be a writer, however, her skills never were up to snuff. And through his memories, while he is stuck in this bed, right, all he has to do is think. That's all he can do. We get to learn his troubled past. So needless to say, we get to learn a lot about Ogi. We get to learn a lot about his past because we are stuck with him, right? We are always in his POV, even though this novel is written in third person, which I thought was kind of strange, but again, I'll talk about that in the writing section. But I really like to take on the character because it's one of those situations, and I've seen this in stories before, and I've critiqued it for not doing what they did in this novel because I thought what they did in the novel was great. It's that there are things we just can't reconcile, right? There's people we can't make up with because they're no longer here. And that's exactly how Ogi finds himself. His mother-in-law is another main character in this book, and she takes care of him. And it's kind of this strange relationship that gets weirder over time. And I shouldn't probably talk about Misery too often, but where Kathy Bates seems kind of cheery and normal in the beginning and slowly devolves into this madman. That's kind of how it is, but it's a little bit different because I wouldn't say his mother-in-law gets crazy violent, right? It's not like she turns into a monster, but there are these really cool, creepy things she does. And horror, as I mentioned, it's all about context, right? It's not like she's lurking in the shadows and making creepy faces and stuff like that. She'll do odd things like burst out in laughter or say very vulgar things in front of people, and it just feels so out of character. And you can almost hear just the sound in the air sucked out of the room in the moment when she does things like that. And so while there was some of that, I kind of wish there was more. I wish it had culminated into something bigger, but I did feel those touches. And honestly, those were probably the single most moments of horror I felt in this book. Ogi's caregiver is another prominent character in this book, and she's kind of weird too. I wouldn't say she gets creepy, but she's very abusive. He's paralyzed, as I mentioned, and she pokes and prods his legs and messes with him and says terrible things to him. And he also has a catheter, so I will let your imagination run wild, concocting all of the images of what she could do with him in that regard. But what I found fascinating about her is not so much with her, but how she made Ogi react. He describes her in great detail. She's overweight. She's pretty gross looking. I think she has hairy armpits, if I remember. But there's moments where he describes her leaning over him, right? And her rolls touching him, and he kind of gets sexually aroused. But the great part is he mentions it himself and that he doesn't know what the hell is going on here. And so it really highlighted a moment in Ogi's psyche that illuminated this strange animalistic urge, even though he wasn't really attracted to her. He was just having physical reactions. And so I thought that was kind of an interesting touch. But overall, I found the characters pretty interesting. They were very distinct, the main three anyway. Ogi, the caregiver, and his mother-in-law, and they all served their purpose in kind of fostering his madness, as he could do nothing but lay there and watch. And I think I should mention also that because he's paralyzed, that creates another dynamic in their relationship, is that he can see the things they're doing to him, but he can't feel it. And so I'm sure you can imagine that that would even further mess with his head. All right, let us talk about the plot next. So how do you tell a story about a man who is paralyzed, who can't speak? I think I forgot to mention that. His jaw was completely shattered, so he can't speak. Everything we get is in his head, right? It's him processing the things he sees and hears, but he can't communicate with anybody. I think that's part of the reason why this novel was short, and unfortunately, it felt pretty long for 150 pages. I clearly finished it. I don't want to say I was completely uninterested. There were things that continually pulled me through, even though I hit a wall of exposition in chapter 2. Chapter 1 had such a great hook. He's in the hospital bed. He's processing what happened right after the accident. And there's almost this ghostly image at the very end. So it was a great hook. And then immediately when we get into chapter 2, big exposition dump. We learn about his past, but thankfully a lot of immediate action was interspersed within that stuff. So while there was far more exposition than I would have liked, we are given breaks with immediate action. But again, we're in his head. He's in a hospital. He eventually goes home and he gets to, well, I shouldn't say interact, but people get to interact with him. Another similarity that came up while I was reading this book was Alfred Hitchcock's Rear Window. If you're not familiar with that story, it's about a man who, I think he broke his leg or something, but he's stuck in his chair or stuck in bed, but he has a great view of his window and he starts to observe all these crazy things going on. So I kind of thought it was going to go that way. He does have somewhat of a view of his window. The garden outside his room plays a massive part in the story. That is where the quote unquote hole is, but it's also metaphorical. And even though part of me wished it would have veered more in that direction, I'm kind of glad it steered clear of it because it would have been too familiar. So once Ogi is home, his mother-in-law starts to get strange, as I mentioned, wearing his wife's clothes, saying strange things. Some of his friends from the university come over and she pretty much embarrasses him, changes his catheter in front of them. So there's all these creepy things that start popping up. And then his caregiver, as I mentioned, is abusive. She invites her son over. They start drinking all the booze and just messing with him. And that's one of the moments of heightened tension I remember, is that what are they going to do to him? Strangely enough, his mother-in-law comes to his aid in that time. But anyway, the garden, as I mentioned, his wife loved the garden and she would spend countless hours out there. And really that's what this book is about. It's the hole in his heart, so to speak, and it's the hole in the garden. And I think that's what I found most interesting about this book, is that it was more than a creepy horror story. In fact, it was kind of horror light. But the metaphor, the depth, the symbolism, all of these things are something you don't often see in horror. And I understand most people read horror to be scared, to be grossed out. But I appreciated that she was trying to do something deeper here. Almost to a fault. I feel like it was leaning that direction almost to a fault, because this novel is billed as a horror novel. There are creepy elements in it, definitely, and I could see how you could call it a horror novel, but with the exception of a handful of moments in this book, there's really nothing creepy about it. So if you're looking for something that is going to be a bleak descent into madness with a protagonist who is surrounded by absolutely horrific people, that's really not what this book is. I don't think that this is what the book was trying to be either. And I do appreciate the layers that the author was bringing to this horror novel. And perhaps that is why I continued on where others might quit. And that's probably why the novel was so divisive. I think from a review standpoint, some of the negative reviews I read we're talking about things don't really come together in the end. And I kind of agree with that, but I also kind of don't. You think you know where it's going, and it pretty much goes that way, with a few exceptions. But I can understand why the ending might not be satisfying for other horror readers out there, because this novel is all about buildup. Nothing really happens till the very end. That is accurate. And I wouldn't say it has a strong ending, but I can appreciate the effort as to what the author was trying to communicate with that ending. Let's talk about the writing itself, or as I like to call it, the cinematography of the novel. Originally written in Korean, translated into English by Sora Kim Russell. Overall, it's a great translation. If you're not new to this channel, you'll know that I've had some issues with some translations from the Asian languages, Japanese, Korean into English in the past with other novels I've read. Haruki Murakami is probably the biggest offender there. Not him, I shouldn't say, the translator. But this one did not suffer from most of those issues. Yes, there's some wooden dialogue. Yes, there's some kind of just odd phrasing here and there. But overall, it did not get in the way. I don't want you to think, though, that the writing here is anything special. It didn't really pull me in. And I think third-person point of view was an interesting choice, though, because we are deeply in Ogi's head, right? We're in his mind entirely. So I would think that if you're trying to immerse the reader, right, and show them his psyche kind of unraveling, first person would have been the best way to go about it. So I'm not sure why the author chose third person in this regard, because there are no other POV characters. You were always in Ogi's perspective. I really think it would have strengthened the element of horror. You would have seen his mind completely unraveling, and even played with the unreliable narrator concept a bit. So no, the writing itself is not bad, but it's also not that great, and I feel like it's a bit of a missed opportunity, which is why I'm going to give The Hole by Hye-Young Pyun a 6.5 out of 10. A horror novel that is a little bit too light on horror for my taste, but heavy with metaphor in a literary fashion, exploring a troubled mind of a man who has lost his wife, and writing that ticks most of the boxes but doesn't present you with a cinematography to enhance what our character went through. So that is it for the review. I hope you enjoyed it. Have you read The Hole? I'm willing to bet you haven't. It was kind of a book that just came out of nowhere for me, but I would love to hear your thoughts if you have. If you like the review, give me a like, subscribe for story-related content just like this, and if you'd like to check out my own creative work, my own novels, you can check out the link in the description. Thanks for hanging out with me. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one. Bye.